The consequences of the First Punic War had left stains across the Mediterranean. Both great nations, who saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the world, had just walked out of a destructive war. From the last video, we learned that Rome won and imposed heavy reparations upon Carthage, where they were forced to pay an unimaginable sum. And I also mentioned that Hamilcar Barca, hero of the First Punic War, had established a kingdom in Spain with his son Hannibal. These two would prove to be very dangerous if left to their own devices, and Rome was keeping an eye, ever vigilant yet not threatening conflict. The Barcade expansion was growing ever northward, and soon there had to be a limit to Carthage's expansion if Rome wished to keep that nation under its thumb. Back in Carthage, disgruntled mercenaries started a conflict just after the First Punic War called the Mercenary War, where they rebelled after not being paid. Yet again, Hamilcar Barca proved his patriotism and defeated the mercenaries. But here's something interesting. He had as much of a hatred towards the weak, corruptible Carthaginian Senate as towards Rome itself, so he decided that the only way was to himself return Carthage to his former glory, by expanding in Spain, as I mentioned beforehand. Hamilcar eventually in his conquest was unfortunately ambushed in a river, and his son-in-law Hasdrubal took over until Hannibal himself eventually took command, and this man would prove to be Rome's greatest enemy, what I would consider death himself to Rome. So what were his achievements that history obsessed over? In 226 BC, with the signing of the Ebro River Treaty, it was declared that lands north of the Ebro were in Roman influence, while those south were Carthaginian. But the catch? We do not know which Ebro the treaty referred to, and this is where we find the pretext of the Second Punic War. Skip forward to 219 BC, and a small city named Saguntum, Israeli land. This unassuming city, a trading hub, would be the hinge that had turned the greatest gate we are considering as the Second Punic War. The Saguntines had secured an alliance with Rome, and you're thinking, why does it matter? Carthage. Hannibal saw this as a clear infringement of the Ebro River Treaty, as the city lay in Carthage's sphere of influence. So Hannibal did the sensible thing and laid siege to the city. The Saguntines yelled for Rome's help, but as if muffled, they weren't heard. Rome did hear, but they replied that they were embroiled in a conquest of Illyria, and they thought that the Saguntines could hold off the Carthaginian juggernaut Hannibal was, until they finished his measly chore. But they will be proven wrong. After the city was pushed from outer wall, to inner wall, to even the citadel itself, the Saguntines had all but surrendered until then, and just accepted fate, raising the white flag. And following true to his oath, Hannibal ordered a thorough sack of the town, plundering, killing, and selling into slavery those fortunate enough to survive. Rome then saw its mistake, and quickly complained about it, sending a Roman senator by the name of Quintus Fabius Maximus, remember that name, and held a debate with the Carthaginian Senate. The atmosphere lay, filled with dread. The senators of Carthage grinned, as Fabius prepared his words. In the folds of my toga, I house both peace and war. Choose what you desire, spat back the Carthaginian Senate. Then, I choose war. These words were Rome itself declaring war to the Carthaginians, and seeking to crush them once and for all. But this war would bleed out Rome, as this campaign would force them to face the greatest challenge they ever did, Hannibal. In 218 BC, Hannibal made the decision to push his ever northward moving army to Italy itself. He crossed the Pyrenees to head through Gaul. The Romans dismissed it as they thought that the Gauls would slow him down until he got to handle him. But Hannibal, ever the clever one, prepared gifts and tribute to the Celts, and he reassured them his wrath only had Rome as its sole target. Eventually we have the famous crossing of the Alps, where Hannibal's army set out in late autumn and crossed in 15 days. 15 days! They endured difficult conditions where they could fall off icy cliffs, freeze from the cold, had their baggage lost on the way, and also mountain tribes rolling boulders down. But the crossing was done, and Hannibal emerged with 20,000 men at his side. After that he needed to win quickly to recruit the local Celts to his cause, and his lucky moment was that at the Battle of Ticinus, where he thrashed the Roman force and earned early support of the Celts. In this way, his forces swelled up to 40,000. Eventually, the consul Sempronius Longus was recalled from Sicily and placed to man the river Trebia along with his co-consul. And here we have the Battle of the Trebia, a battle that was the first of three major battles in which the story plays around. Here we see the strategies of Hannibal, and how he used the terrain and his enemy psychology to his advantage. Longus was a hot-headed man, and reports from a scouting force of Celts reported to him these attributes. The night before, he sent his brother Mago and a unit of 1,000 cavalry to hide in a bush. Then, as dawn almost broke, a force of Numidian cavalry provoked the Roman camp and forced Longus out of bed and his men as well. The Roman soldiers did not eat, and they hastily wore their armor and took their weapons, and they were forced to cross the freezing Trebia, which would sometimes be neck deep. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian force had eaten and were nice and ready to fight, so they were ultimately superior, and the battle went as figured, a devastating Roman loss. Early spring of 217 BC was the time that Hannibal decided to move even faster. He made the cross towards the Arno marshlands to move in secrecy. It was a painful trek reminiscent of the Alpine cross. Men had to stand up for 4 days, with many things being lost as they marched through muddy water. Men would see mounds of dirt and sleep, only to drown. Some would rest for a second, only to be whipped back into marching. After that, they planned to lure the Roman armies and secure another victory to keep the loyalty of the Celts and to fuel their campaign. I want to mention that after the cross, a march disease had ravaged Hannibal's eyes, and one got infected so much he plucked it out with his sword, and he forever had an eye patch with him. Eventually, Hannibal had struck gold. The new consul, Flaminius, was as hot-headed as Longus, and he decided to pull the old trick of luring an ambush. In the shores of Lake Trasimene, in 217 BC, the Roman force led by Flaminius decided to pursue the enemy force, which was just luring them, and Hannibal with this man went to annihilate. Many met their end. Ian and Flaminius himself was slain. Their surviving Roman force was horrified by the bloody mess they saw of the battlefield later on. Another defeat. Another insult by Hannibal. Will Rome continue as such? And here we have what Rome did in times of crisis. Dictatorship. Today you hear that word in division Kaiser or Stalin, but they were far different than the word refers to today. It was the office where one man had absolute power over the crisis, was democratically ratified by the Senate, and strangely to our modern ideology, gave it their power after 6 months, willingly. And here we return, the man who had issued the declaration, Fabius. He was elected dictator and set out to deal with Hannibal. He did one thing that all of Rome hated, a strategy that wouldn't bring Rome glory or victory, it wouldn't nullify the threat of Hannibal, but it would definitely save Rome in the end. This, known today as the Fabian strategy, was used by generals such as Washington and Tully to pull victory from perceived defeat. The strategy was simple: to not fight the enemy directly, instead use a war of attrition to choke his supply line, sort of contain the enemy and avoid at all costs direct confrontation, instead preferring patience and re-strengthening. The Romans were livid at this idea, and they jeered in the streets, calling Fabius all sorts of things. The Senate even gave him the mocking title of Cunctator, meaning delayer. Eventually, Fabius left the reins of rule and instead took 2 consuls, who yet again had one of them as a hothead. The lot were Paulus and Varro, with Varro being the jerk. Now we have to address the war elephant in the room. What was Hannibal doing? Well, he had taken the supply depot at Cannae in the spring of 216 BC and fueled up for his main campaign of forcing Rome's southern allies to defect. To this, Varro in his short temper led to him raising almost 16 legions, nearing around 80 to 85,000 men, and took positions near the field. Paulus objected, and he argued to take the hill upper ground, but Varro acted blind to Hannibal's advantage of the Numidian cavalry and, like an idiot, thought that going big would win him that glorious victory. It wouldn't. What followed would be Rome's greatest disaster, a wound only reopened in Imperium with Arusio on the Teutoburg forest ambush. The Roman force, big and strong, moved as a block towards the enemy. Hannibal had deployed his army in an inverted crescent with his weaker infantry in the center and his elite Libyan infantry in the flanks. After the Numidian regiment kept chasing the Roman cavalry, the infantry, shaped as a crescent, kept bending as the Romans pushed like a ram in the front. And what happens next is what cements Cannae as the battle in the annals of battle history, the encirclement of a larger force with a significantly smaller force. And the cherry on top was that the Numidian cavalry basically capped the whole force, and a full encirclement was done. And the elite flanks, they were as fresh as spring water, so they jumped the poor Romans, and the battle became a slaughter. At least 67,500 Romans were killed and many more were captured. Several nobles met their ends, like Marcus Minucius Rufus, who was the master of horse to Fabius the year prior, and understood Fabius' wisdom, and Paulus, poor Paulus, who just the day prior pleaded to Varro to take the better positions. And in one of the greatest last stands of Cannae, he proclaimed this to his close: Cornelius, do not waste in useless pity the few moments left to escape from the hands of the enemy. Go! Announce publicly to the Senate that they must fortify Rome and make its defenses strong before the victorious army approaches. And tell Fabius that privately that I have remembered his precepts in both life and death. Suffer me to breathe my last among my slaughtered soldiers. Let me not have to defend myself again when I am no longer consul, or appear as the accuser of my colleague and protect my own innocence by throwing guilt on another. This long speech was honorable, but the treacherous Varro had fled with his tail between his legs, in the most traitorous and inglorious way ever possible, who feared death rather than his shame. About 6,000 ranks of fallen nobles were poured into the floor in the Carthaginian Senate, a true testament to Hannibal's bloodlust. With this, Fabius returned as consul in 215 BC, and as the condition was too terrible, even the Senate had realized his wisdom. Cannae had left Rome dry, and Rome's allies threw the towel, joining Hannibal's ranks. Capua was the largest one, officially signing Hannibal's in 214 BC. Even Macedon had pledged to Hannibal. With all this loss and all these defeats, you thought Rome would lose. But what's all this Rome win stuff? I thought Rome would win, you might ask. Let me tell you that where Rome was failing, it was also being a bit better elsewhere. In Iberia, the forces of Asdrubal, Hannibal's brother, had been fighting the Roman forces sent there, and in their command was the son of Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young Scipio, who would later be titled Africanus. This man, who had barely reached 25 years, was in charge of the Iberian contingent. Why? The Senate considered command in Iberia suicide, and they had no volunteers except Scipio. But he proved to be the right man for the job. His lightning-fast campaigns were devastating, so let me tell them to you. In 209 BC, he moved to take the jewel of Iberia, the city of Carthago Nova. The city was interesting in the way it was built. It had 4 walls, with one abutted to a lagoon's shore. Scipio's men had taken positions in the other 3 and sent a small contingent through a lagoon. And then a squall came. Quick context: squall means the tide caused by wind. The squall basically parted the waters and let that unit take over the almost undefended city wall, and eventually they took over the city completely. Now, Scipio knew that Hasdrubal and other armies were only 10 days away from catching him, so he moved quickly and fought Hasdrubal at the Battle of Vicula. The Carthaginians were defeated and Hasdrubal went to join his brother in Italy. He crossed the Alps, but unlike Hannibal, was quickly dealt with and in a cruel act of vengeance, sent Hannibal his brother's head. Scipio kept surprising everyone with his tactics. He was almost a Roman Hannibal. Eventually, it all boiled down to one major battle that would decide who gets to rule Iberia, and that would be the Battle of Ilipa. This is basically the Roman Cannae, and I'll show you why. When the armies camped and met for battle, they didn't fight, at least for some days. Eventually, the position felt like they'd be like how they'd be in the battle. And the Carthaginians thought that they beat Scipio due to them knowing his position, heavy infantry in the center, and weak infantry in the flanks. But to their surprise, when the army was reversed, now the strong flanked and the weak centered. Scipio's flanks thrashed, his center moving so slowly that the enemy center didn't budge, and it was a resounding Roman victory, and Iberia fell in de facto Roman control. But now they wanted to truly threaten Carthage by invading their heartland. But unlike the first attempt, this would be more successful. First, Rome tried to persuade Syphax, the Numidian king who sympathized with them, to join, but a marriage proposal from the Carthaginians made him change mind. Eventually, they sweet-talked Massinissa, the other king, to help Rome, and they supported him defeating Syphax. Massinissa liked the offer of an ally, giving Rome their own Numidian cavalry. Eventually, 205 BC, Scipio marshaled forces from Sicily and headed for Africa. Rome and Carthage were about to sign a peace treaty, with Carthage regarding Hannibal and Mago, but after they arrived, Carthage did not sign the treaty. Hannibal set out, and in 202 BC, his few forces met Scipio at Zama. And this, my friends, is the last battle of this war. The meeting between student and master. Did Scipio surpass Hannibal, or did Hannibal still outshine him? We'll see now. Before the battle, the two generals rode out in person and spoke to each other. Hannibal's eloquence was matched with Scipio's fierce rhetoric, which I shall paraphrase. At the war's beginning, my fortune in Italy was immense, but take a look at my current situation. A sad old man, who just like other sad old men, failed to conquer Rome. Your fortune can change in the blink of an eye, Scipio. Consider peace, rather than risking life and limb in this fight. Scipio returned. Negotiate? What the devil will we negotiate? I am going to raise your worthless city. What will measly negotiations offer? I am in charge of it all. The forces were almost the same in position. The Roman cavalry engaged as the enemy won, ordering a pursuit far from the battlefield at one point, and the centers clashed. Hannibal tried to use his elephants, but due to Scipio's tactics, they backfired. Eventually, the Roman cavalry returned on time, and Hannibal was defeated at this point. The following treaty was harsher than any treaty ever that the Romans asked of. An indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver paid over 50 years with hostages taken. Carthage's territory could be reduced to simply Tunisia, and that they could not start wars without Rome's explicit permission. Hannibal retired from the battlefield and picked up politics, only to leave due to corruption and embezzlement issues that he fixed beforehand, but then got too hand out of jealousy. On the other hand, Scipio was granted to triumph in Rome, elected as consul, but he too left due to political jealousy. Hannibal would take refuge in Tyre, then moved to Antioch, hoping to meet Antiochus the Great, who was in Ephesus, so he went there. He then helped in small client wars in Bithynia and Pergamon's conflict respectively, and then retired fully. He then drank poison to evade Roman capture, and left us his final words. Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety that they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. The conflict lasted 17 years, with Rome winning. 50 years later, Carthage would be fully destroyed by Scipio's adopted grandson, and Rome would rule the Mediterranean solely. It has been a wonderful series, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.